Beneath the mountains of Terra, in vaults that predated the Imperium itself, the Emperor worked alone. The world above was still burning. The unification wars had not yet ended. Warlords carved fiefdoms from the ruins of old Earth, and techno-barbarians ruled over populations that had forgotten the stars. But in the hidden forges beneath the Himalayan peaks, something greater than conquest was being shaped. The Emperor had seen the galaxy in his visions. He had walked the threads of possible futures and found them all collapsing into darkness unless humanity could be reforged, elevated, made worthy of survival. And so he labored in silence, away from the eyes of even his most trusted gene-rights and mechanicum acolytes, to create not merely soldiers but demigods. The Primarch project was born in those lightless halls. 20 gene templates, each one a fragment of the Emperor's own essence, distilled and refined into forms that could endure where mortals failed. They were not his sons in any biological sense, though the Imperium would later name them so. They were instruments, each designed to embody a singular facet of human potential carried to transhuman extremes. One was forged to be a general without peer, another a savage executioner, a third a scholar-sorcerer, a fourth an architect of empires. Each was a reflection, but none were copies. The Emperor gave them individuality because the galaxy's threats were too varied for a single answer. Tyrants, Xenos, warp spawn, entropy itself, all would require different blades to carve them from the Imperium's path. The work was vast and terrible. Gene helixes were threaded with psychic resonance. Organs were cultivated that could not exist in nature. Bones were laced with substances that would harden under stress into something stronger than ceramite. The Primarchs would be immortal in all but name, capable of learning faster than any mortal mind, of commanding armies through sheer presence, of enduring wounds that would obliterate lesser beings. But the Emperor knew that flesh alone would not be enough. He reached into the warp itself, binding fragments of the Imperium to each template, anchoring their souls in ways that would make them beacons of will and purpose. It was sorcery married to science, theology stitched into biology, and the line between the two became invisible in the forge's incandescent glow. The vaults reeked of ozone and burnt iron. Servitors moved in silence, their lobotomized minds incapable of understanding what they assembled. Nutrient vats, the size of hab blocks, hummed with subsonic vibrations as the Primarchs grew within their amniotic prisons, suspended in liquids that shimmered with unnatural light. The Emperor watched them through the glass, his face unreadable. He had not slept in decades. Time, for him, was a resource to be spent without hesitation. The future he had seen demanded speed. Humanity's window of survival was narrowing, and if the Primarchs were not ready when the stars opened once more, the species would drown in the dark. But the powers of the warp were watching. The ruinous gods had observed the Emperor's rise with interest and alarm. He was anathema to them, a being whose existence defied their dominion over the souls of mankind. His vision of a secular Imperium, free from superstition and worship, was a dagger aimed at their hearts. And now he dared to create warriors who could resist their whispers, commanders who could unite humanity and sever the warp's grip on the material realm. The Chaos Gods could not allow it. They reached into the vaults through cracks in reality that even the Emperor's wards could not fully seal. They had patience, they had cunning, and they waited for the moment when his attention faltered. It came during the final stages of the Primarch's gestation. The warp convulsed. Storms erupted across the Imperium, tearing at the boundaries between thought and matter. In the vaults, alarms shrieked as reality itself began to unravel. The nutrient vats shattered. The Primarchs, still infants but already larger and stronger than any human child, were torn from their cradles by invisible hands. The Emperor reached for them, his will blazing like a star, but the forces arrayed against him were the accumulated malice of 4 gods who had schemed in concert for this single instant. The Primarchs vanished into the warp, scattered across the galaxy like seeds cast into a hurricane. The silence that followed was absolute. The Emperor stood alone among the ruins of his greatest work, surrounded by broken glass and the acrid stench of spilled gene fluids. The vaults, which had been filled with the promise of a reborn humanity, were now tombs. The servitors had ceased functioning, their circuits fried by the psychic backlash. The machines were silent. For a time that no record measures, the Emperor did not move. He had foreseen many futures, but this precise betrayal had eluded him. The primarchs were gone. His sons, his instruments, his answers to the galaxy's endless threats, all of them lost to the warp's cruel tides. But the Emperor did not despair. Despair was a mortal weakness, and he had abandoned mortality long ago. He turned instead to what remained. The Primarch project had required decades of preparation, genetic samples drawn from his own immortal flesh, sorcerous rituals that could not be replicated without risking another catastrophic breach. But the gene seed matrices, the biological templates used to create the Primarchs, those still existed. They were incomplete, fragmented, lacking the psychic and sorcerous bindings that had made the Primarchs true demigods. But they could still be used. The Emperor had always planned to create armies to serve beneath the Primarchs, warriors who would carry their gene father's strengths into battle. Now those warriors would have to march without their lords, at least until the scattered Primarchs could be found. The Space Marine legions were born from that necessity. The Emperor withdrew from the shattered vaults and turned his efforts to a new forge complex, one vast enough to produce soldiers by the thousands. The gene seed harvested from the Primarch templates was refined, distilled into implantable organs that could transform a human youth into a transhuman warrior. 19 organs in total, each one a miracle of genecraft, each one carrying a sliver of the Primarchs' inhuman might. A secondary heart to ensure redundancy, a third lung to process toxins, an osmodula to reinforce the skeleton, a biscopia to enhance muscle growth. Glands that could spit acid, eyes that could see in absolute darkness, a preomna that could digest alien poisons. The implantation process was agonizing and often fatal. But those who survived emerged as something more than human, stronger, faster, and bound by loyalty so deeply encoded into their biology that rebellion was almost inconceivable. Almost. The first recruits were drawn from the gene tribes of Terra, the survivors of the Unification Wars who had proven their worth in blood. They were children, most of them, boys no older than 12 or 13, their bodies still malleable enough to accept the gene seed's restructuring. They were taken into the fortress monasteries that began to rise across Terra's surface, vast fortifications that were equal parts barracks, temple, and gene forge. There they were tested, trained, indoctrinated, and implanted. Most died. Their bodies rejected the gene seed, or the surgeries failed, or the hypno-conditioning broke their minds. But those who endured became the first Space Marines, the Legiones Astartes, and they knelt before the Emperor in their grey Mark I power armor, ready to conquer the stars in his name. Each legion bore the numeral of its missing Primarch. The 1st Legion, the 3rd, the 7th, the 10th, 20 in total, though the records of 2 would later be expunged so thoroughly that even their numbers became unspoken. Each legion inherited not only the physical traits of its gene father, but also the flaws, the mutations, the fractures hidden within the genetic helix. Some were obvious from the beginning. The sons of the 8th Legion were prone to visions of death and violence, their minds haunted by precognitive flashes that drove many to madness. The sons of the 12th were afflicted with a neurological defect that amplified aggression and eroded empathy, a flaw that would later be weaponized through the implantation of cortical devices. The sons of the 9th suffered from a thirst that no amount of water could quench, a hunger that whispered in their blood. But the Emperor did not halt production. The legions were imperfect, but they were necessary. The galaxy was vast and hostile, and humanity's enemies would not wait for perfection. The Emperor knew that the Primarchs, when found, would stabilize their legion's gene seed and perhaps even cure the inherited flaws. Until then, the legions would serve as they were, broken but unbowed, weapons sharp enough to carve an Imperium from the void. The Lunar Wolves were the first to achieve full operational strength. They were aggressive, adaptable, and utterly ruthless in prosecution of the Emperor's will. They fought in the final battles of the Unification Wars, storming the last holds of the Terran warlords and grinding resistance into dust. The Emperor watched them closely. They would become his template, the standard against which all other legions would be measured. When the stars opened once more and the warp storms that had isolated Terra for millennia began to recede, it was the lunar wolves who led the first expeditionary fleets into the void, carrying the Imperium's message to the scattered colonies of mankind. The Great Crusade had begun, but its architects were still lost. The Emperor turned his gaze outward, sending his fleets in all directions, searching for the primarchs who had been stolen from him. He knew they lived. The warp had scattered them, not slain them. Somewhere among the stars, on worlds he had never seen, his sons were growing. Some would be raised by kings, others by slaves. Some would rise to command armies before they reached adulthood. Others would endure horrors that would have broken lesser beings, but they would survive. The Emperor had made them to endure, and when he found them, the legions would be whole. For now, the Space Marines marched without their fathers. They bore the Emperor's aquila on their chests and his genecraft in their veins, and they went into the dark with faith that their purpose would be revealed. They did not yet know the names of the worlds their primarchs walked. They did not yet know the doctrines their gene fathers would teach, the colors they would wear, the oaths they would swear. They were numbered, not named. They were tools, not yet legends. But beneath Terra, in the vaults where the primarchs had been stolen, the machinery still hummed. The Emperor had not abandoned the gene forges. New Space Marines were being created every day, their numbers swelling as the Imperium's need for soldiers grew. Entire fortress monasteries were constructed on distant worlds, recruiting from populations that had only just sworn fealty to Terra. The Gene Seed Tithes began, a sacred tradition in which each fallen Space Marine's genetic legacy was harvested and returned to the Legion, ensuring that the gene line could continue. It was a cycle of death and rebirth, a biological immortality that mirrored the Emperor's vision of an eternal Imperium. Yet the flaws remained. The 8th Legion's visions grew darker, their brutality more extreme. The 12th's aggression became uncontrollable in some squads, requiring restraint protocols and penal sanctions. The 17th developed a troubling tendency toward religious fervor, despite the Emperor's strict prohibition on worship. These were not defects that could be excised through surgery or conditioning. They were woven into the gene seed itself, inheritances from primarchs who had been shaped by forces the Emperor could not predict. And because the primarchs were still missing, the legions could not be corrected. They could only be managed, their worst tendencies suppressed through discipline and doctrine. The Thunder Warriors had been different. They were the Emperor's first transhuman soldiers, created during the Unification Wars to break the Warlord's armies and bring Terra to heel. They were stronger than Space Marines, more savage, less stable. They aged rapidly, their augmentations degraded. They were never meant to last beyond the conquest of Terra, and when the Unification Wars ended, the Emperor ordered their extermination. It was done quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. The Thunder Warriors were obsolete, and the Emperor did not keep obsolete weapons. The Space Marines who replaced them were superior in every measurable way, more durable, more controllable, capable of sustained campaigns across decades and centuries. But some among the early legions had fought alongside the Thunder Warriors. They had seen what the Emperor did to warriors who outlived their purpose. It was a lesson they did not forget. Loyalty was enforced through indoctrination, through psycho-conditioning so thorough that the mere thought of betrayal caused physical pain. The Space Marines were taught that the Emperor was humanity's salvation, that his vision was infallible, that service to the Imperium was the highest calling a being could achieve. They were shown the horrors of Old Night, the age of strife when humanity's empire had collapsed into barbarism and madness. They were told that only through unity, only through the Emperor's guidance, could mankind reclaim the stars and ensure its survival. And they believed. Most of them believed, but belief is not the same as understanding. The Space Marines were warriors, not philosophers. They knew how to kill, how to endure, how to conquer. They did not question why the Emperor forbade the worship of gods when his own power seemed divine. They did not ask why the warp was forbidden when their own librarians wielded its energies in battle. They did not wonder what had happened to the Thunder Warriors, or whether the same fate awaited them if the Imperium ever achieved final victory. They served because they were made to serve. It was their purpose, encoded into their very cells, and in the void beyond Terra, the galaxy waited. Millions of human worlds, isolated and ignorant, unaware that the Emperor's fleets were coming. Alien empires that had feasted on mankind's weakness during Old Night, growing fat on human suffering. Orc hordes that bred in the darkness between stars, warp-tainted nightmares that whispered promises of power to those desperate or foolish enough to listen. The Great Crusade would face them all, and the Space Marine legions would be its cutting edge. But first, the primarchs had to be found. The Emperor's search continued, his psychic senses reaching across the galaxy, following the faint echoes of his stolen sons. He found them one by one, scattered across 100 different worlds, shaped by 100 different upbringings. Some had become kings, others had been slaves, some were warlords, others were prophets, and when the Emperor came to them, descended from the heavens in golden light, they recognized him. Not because they remembered the vaults beneath Terra, their infant minds had retained nothing of that stolen moment, but because the Emperor had made them to recognize him, to know instinctively that they were part of something greater. The First Legion would be the first to meet its primarch. Though the records do not say when or where, the histories conflict, fragments preserved in data crypts and oral traditions that have been corrupted by time, but all agree that when Lionel Johnson was found, the First Legion changed. They adopted the colors of Caliban, the green and bone white of knightly orders, and they became the Dark Angels, the Emperor's executioners, the ones who fought the wars that could not be spoken of. They were secretive, proud, uncompromising, and they would remain so for 10,000 years, long after their primarch vanished and their brothers were scattered. But that was still to come. For now, the legions were nameless, faceless, numbered. They fought in grey armor, bearing only the Imperium symbols, and they left behind no monuments, no songs, no stories. They were ghosts of wars not yet remembered. And in the vaults beneath Terra, the Emperor continued his work, refining the gene seed, improving the implantation process, preparing for the day when his sons would return and the legions would be complete. He did not know that the scattering had been more than theft. The Chaos Gods had not simply stolen the primarchs. They had placed them deliberately on worlds chosen to corrupt, to twist, to shape them into weapons that could be turned against their father. Angron was cast onto a world of gladiatorial slavery, where pain and bloodshed would become his only truth. Lorgar was raised in a theocratic nightmare, taught to worship gods who would one day betray him. Fulgrim was placed among artisans who prized perfection to the point of obsession. Mortarion endured the poisoned rule of a necromantic tyrant. And Horus, the brightest and best, was sent to a world of gangs and violence, where he would learn that loyalty was a resource, not a virtue. The Emperor believed he could overcome these influences. He was wrong. But the mistake would not become clear until the fires of the Horus heresy burned across the galaxy, and by then the legions would be so deeply divided that no reconciliation was possible. For now, they marched in unity, ignorant of the future, focused only on the present. The Imperium was expanding. Worlds were being brought into compliance. Humanity's lost colonies were being reclaimed, their populations reintegrated into the greater whole, whether they wished it or not. And at the forefront of every conquest, the Space Marines stood ready, bolters in hand, faith in their gene-father unshaken. They did not yet know what they would become. They did not yet know the horrors they would commit, the glories they would achieve, the nightmares they would endure. They were simply soldiers, the Emperor's finest, the bulwark against the darkness. And in the vaults beneath the Himalayan peaks, where broken glass still littered the floor and the nutrient vats stood empty, the gene forges continued to hum, producing more warriors, more gene seed, more instruments of the Emperor's will. The primarchs were lost, but the legions endured, and one day, When the sons of the Emperor returned, the galaxy would learn what it meant to face warriors who were born from the fusion of flesh and divinity, science and sorcery, hope and ruin. The first primarch was found on a world where forests stretched to the horizon and knightly orders ruled from stone fortresses older than memory. Caliban was a realm of monsters and chivalry, where armored warriors hunted beasts born from warp taint and the people huddled behind walls that had stood for generations. The Emperor's fleet arrived in silence, descending through cloud-wreathed skies to find a war already in progress. In the depths of the Caliban forests, a knight in black armor fought alone against horrors that should not have existed, creatures spawned from the planet's proximity to warp rifts that the locals called the Tangle. He fought with a sword that sang through corrupted flesh, and when the Emperor approached him, the knight knelt not in submission but in recognition. This was Lionel Johnson, first of the scattered sons to be reclaimed, though he was not the first created. He had been raised by the knightly orders of Caliban, taught discipline and honor, warfare and secrecy. When the Emperor offered him command of the First Legion, the Lion accepted without hesitation. The Dark Angels were born in that moment. The grey-clad warriors who had fought as nameless enforcers took the heraldry of their Primarch's adopted world, bone-white and forest green, the colors of death and renewal. They adopted the traditions of Caliban's knightly orders, restructuring their ranks into wings and circles, each with its own purpose, its own secrets. The Lion brought with him a culture of paranoia and excellence, an insistence that wars be won through precision rather than brute force. He trusted no one fully, not even his own gene sons, and he taught them to suspect treachery in every shadow. Under his command, the Dark Angels became the Emperor's instrument for wars that could not be spoken of, campaigns against foes so terrible that their existence was erased from imperial records the moment victory was achieved. But the Lion was only the beginning. Across the galaxy, the Emperor's search continued, and one by one the Primarchs were found. Fulgrim was discovered on Kamos, a mineral-poor world where starvation had been the norm until the young Primarch reorganized its society into a meritocracy of artisans and engineers. He had saved his people through aesthetics and efficiency, teaching them that survival was not enough, humanity must strive for perfection in all things. When the Emperor granted him the Third Legion, Fulgrim wept openly, overcome by the honor. His warriors became the Emperor's children, clad in purple and gold, obsessed with martial excellence to the point of arrogance. They polished their armor until it gleamed, practiced their blade work until every motion was flawless, and fought with a precision that bordered on theatricality. Fulgrim taught them that war was an art form, that killing could be beautiful if executed with enough skill. Perturabo was found on Olympia, a world of city-states locked in endless sieges and counter-sieges. He had been raised by the tyrant of Lochos, taught mathematics and engineering, architecture and warfare. But Olympia had given him no love, only duty and resentment. The people feared him for his genius. The rulers used him as a weapon, and when the Emperor arrived, Perturabo saw only another master demanding service. He took command of the Fourth Legion without joy, renaming them the Iron Warriors and turning them into the Imperium's siege breakers. They were methodical, brutal, and utterly without mercy. Perturabo taught them to view fortifications as problems to be solved through overwhelming firepower and mathematical precision. If a wall could not be breached, it would be reduced to rubble. If a city resisted, it would be obliterated as an example. The Iron Warriors earned no glory, only the hardest, most grinding campaigns, and their Primarch accepted this with silent bitterness, knowing that he was the Emperor's favored tool precisely because he never complained. Jagatai Khan was found on Chogaris, a feral world of endless steppes where horseback nomads warred beneath wide skies. He had united the tribes through speed and cunning, teaching them that mobility was superior to static defense, that a war could be won by striking where the enemy was weakest and vanishing before retaliation arrived. When the Emperor gave him the Fifth Legion, Jagatai transformed them into the White Scars, fast attack specialists who disdained trench warfare and siege tactics. They fought from bikes and gunships, appearing without warning and disappearing into the void before reinforcements could arrive. Jagatai taught them to laugh at danger, to prize freedom over rigid discipline, and to trust their instincts over strategic doctrine. The White Scars were outsiders among the legions, rarely understood, often underestimated, but never defeated when they chose the ground of battle. Leman Russ was found on Fenris, a death world of ice and wolves, where survival required savagery that civilized worlds could scarcely comprehend. He had been raised by wolves in truth, adopted by a pack, and later by a tribe of human hunters who recognized his strength and made him their king. Fenris taught him that mercy was weakness, that only the strong deserved to live, and that loyalty to one's pack was the highest virtue. When the Emperor arrived, Russ challenged him to contests of strength and cunning, and when the Emperor won, Russ knelt and swore an oath that would endure for 10,000 years. The 6th Legion became the Space Wolves, warriors who rejected the clinical detachment of other legions in favor of ferocity and brotherhood. They howled in battle, adorned their armor with pelts and totems, and drank deeply from the cup of violence. Russ taught them that they were the Emperor's executioners, the ones who would destroy other legions if the need arose. It was a grim duty, but Russ bore it without complaint, knowing that someone had to be willing to kill their own brothers if the Imperium demanded it. Rogel Dawn was found on Inwit, a frozen world of ice hives where life was sustained only through rigid discipline and unyielding fortitude. He had been adopted by the ruling house of Inwit and raised to value duty above all else. When the Emperor gave him the 7th Legion, Dawn renamed them the Imperial Fists and turned them into the finest defensive specialists in the Imperium. They built fortifications that could withstand orbital bombardment, held ground that other legions would have abandoned, and endured sieges that would have broken lesser warriors through sheer attrition. Dawn taught them that pain was irrelevant, that suffering was a test to be passed, and that retreat was the greatest dishonor. The Imperial Fists became synonymous with stubbornness, their gene sons indoctrinated to believe that surrender was impossible even when death was certain. Conrad Kersey was found on Nostramo, a world of perpetual darkness where crime syndicates ruled and murder was currency. He had grown in the depths of the underhives, a feral child haunted by visions of death and atrocity. He rose to power through terror, becoming Night Haunter, a phantom who killed criminals in ways so horrific that the mere rumor of his presence brought order through fear. When the Emperor found him, Kersey had already united Nostramo under his brutal rule, transforming it into a world where lawlessness had been replaced by absolute obedience born of terror. The Emperor gave him the 8th Legion, and Kersey renamed them the Night Lords, teaching them that fear was the most efficient weapon in the Imperium's arsenal. They flayed their enemies alive, broadcast screams across Vox networks, and left battlefields strewn with corpses arranged in grotesque displays. Kersey taught them that justice and terror were inseparable, that the galaxy would only obey the Imperium if it learned to fear the consequences of defiance. Sanguinius was found on Baal, a radioactive wasteland where mutants fought for scraps and the sky glowed with the light of dying suns. He had been born with wings, a mutation that should have marked him for death among the Radscarred tribes, but instead they worshipped him as an angel. Sanguinius united the tribes of Baal through charisma and compassion, teaching them that survival did not require brutality, that hope could exist even in the most desolate places. When the Emperor arrived, Sanguinius wept for joy, knowing that his people would finally have a future beyond the wastes of Baal. The 9th Legion became the Blood Angels, warriors of terrible beauty who fought with grace and fury intertwined. Sanguinius taught them to aspire to nobility, to fight not out of hatred but out of love for humanity. Yet the gene seed carried a curse, a flaw inherited from the Primarch himself, the Red Thirst, an insatiable hunger for blood, and the Black Rage, a madness that would one day consume them all. Sanguinius knew of the curse, and he bore it in silence, knowing that to reveal it would condemn his sons. Ferris Manus was found on Medusa, a volcanic world where the weak were culled by nature and the strong were forged in fire. He had plunged his hands into the living metal of a serpent beast and emerged with arms of silver necrodermis, stronger than any armor. The clans of Medusa revered him as a god, but Ferris rejected worship and taught them instead to value strength and self-reliance. When the Emperor gave him the 10th Legion, Ferrus renamed them the Iron Hands and instilled in them a hatred of weakness in all its forms. They replaced their flesh with bionics at the earliest opportunity, believing that meat was failure and metal was truth. Ferrus taught them that the universe respected only strength, that sentiment was a liability, and that victory justified any cost. The Iron Hands became the most uncompromising of the legions, willing to sacrifice entire populations if it meant achieving tactical superiority. Angron was found on Nuceria, a world of blood and slavery where gladiators fought for the amusement of debased aristocrats. He had been a slave, implanted with cortical devices called the butcher's nails that turned pain into pleasure and reduced thought to rage. He led a slave revolt, and when it failed, he and his brothers were surrounded on a mountaintop, awaiting execution. The Emperor arrived and teleported Angron away, leaving his fellow slaves to die. Angron never forgave him. The 12th Legion became the World Eaters, and Angron encouraged them to implant the nails into their own skulls, transforming them into berserkers who knew only bloodlust. He taught them nothing because he had nothing to teach but hatred. The World Eaters became butchers, effective in the short term but unsustainable, their gene seed degrading with every generation as the nails eroded their sanity. Rabuti Giliman was found on Macrage, a prosperous world of order and civic virtue where governance was considered a sacred duty. He had been raised by the planetary consul and taught statecraft, logistics, and the principles of enlightened rule. When the Emperor arrived, Gilliman had already transformed Macrage into the jewel of its sector, a model of efficiency and justice. The 13th Legion became the Ultramarines, and Gilliman turned them into the most versatile and disciplined force in the Imperium. He wrote treatises on warfare, governance, and logistics, codifying principles that would later form the foundation of the Codex Astartes. Gilliman taught his sons that war was not an end in itself, but a means to bring order and civilization to the galaxy. The Ultramarines became synonymous with reliability, the legion that could be deployed anywhere and trusted to achieve victory through superior planning and execution. Mortarion was found on Barbarous, a world shrouded in toxic mists where necromantic overlords ruled from mountaintop fortresses. He had been raised by one of these tyrants and escaped to lead the human tribes in rebellion. Mortarion climbed toward the highest fortress to kill his adoptive father, but the toxins nearly destroyed him, and the Emperor intervened, slaying the tyrant in Mortarion's place. Mortarion resented the intervention, feeling robbed of his vengeance. The 14th Legion became the Death Guard, and Mortarion taught them to endure poisons, toxins, and environmental hazards that would kill other warriors. They fought in conditions so lethal that even other space marines refused deployment, and they bore their suffering with grim pride. Mortarion taught them that endurance was the highest virtue, that the strong survived not through brilliance but through sheer refusal to die. Magnus the Red was found on Prospero, a world of scholars and sorcerers where knowledge was the highest pursuit. He had been born with a single eye and skin, the color of blood, a psyker of staggering power who had unified Prospero's fractious cults into a single academy of enlightenment. Magnus believed that the warp was a tool to be mastered, that sorcery and science were two paths toward the same truth. When the Emperor gave him the 15th Legion, Magnus renamed them the Thousand Sons and filled their ranks with warrior scholars who wielded the warp as weapon and shield. He taught them to push the boundaries of psychic mastery, ignoring the Emperor's warnings about the dangers of the Imperium. Magnus believed himself wise enough to avoid corruption, and his sons followed him into damnation with eyes open and minds certain. Horus was found on Chthoniya, a world of hive gangs and brutal meritocracy where survival required cunning and charisma as much as strength. He had risen to lead the most powerful gang before the Emperor arrived, and when father and son met, Horus wept and swore eternal loyalty. The Emperor loved him above all others, naming him War Master and granting him command over the entire Great Crusade. The 16th Legion became the Sons of Horus, and later the Lunar Wolves, warriors who emulated their primarch's genius for strategy and diplomacy. Horus taught them to win wars before the first shot was fired, to turn enemies into allies and allies into tools. He was the brightest star in the Emperor's firmament, and his fall would therefore cast the longest shadow. Lorgar was found on Colchis, a world of religious zealotry where faith was enforced through inquisition and martyrdom. He had been raised by the covenant of priests who ruled Colchis, taught that worship was the highest calling, and that gods walked among men. When the emperor arrived, Lorgar saw him as divine and built the 17th Legion into an army of warrior monks. The word-bearers spread the emperor's truth, but they did so through cathedral fortresses and enforced conversion. Lorgar taught them that the Imperium was not merely a political entity but a faith, and that compliance meant more than submission, it meant belief. The emperor rebuked him, ordering the destruction of a city Lorgar had spent decades perfecting as a monument to worship. The humiliation broke something in Lorgar, and he began searching for gods who would welcome his devotion. Vulcan was found on Nocturne, a volcanic death world where survival required cooperation and self-sacrifice. He had united the scattered tribes by teaching them to craft weapons and tools, to value each other's lives as much as their own. When the emperor gave him the 18th Legion, Vulcan renamed them the Salamanders and taught them that humanity was worth defending, that space marines existed to protect the weak, not to rule them. The Salamanders became the most compassionate of the legions, the ones who would risk their own lives to evacuate civilians, who would hold ground to buy time for refugees to escape. Vulcan taught them that fire purified, that destruction and creation were two sides of the same forge, and that a warrior's worth was measured not in kills but in lives saved. Corax was found on Deliverance, a moon where slaves mined ore for distant masters, and death was the only escape. He had led a rebellion, freeing his people through guerrilla warfare and asymmetric tactics that turned the oppressor's strength against them. When the emperor arrived, Corax had already won his war. The 19th Legion became the Raven Guard, specialists in stealth and precision strikes. Corax taught them to fight from the shadows, to kill commanders and collapse armies through decapitation rather than attrition. The Raven Guard became ghosts, appearing without warning and vanishing before retaliation, and Corax taught them that victory belonged to those who struck first and disappeared fastest. Alfarius was found last, or so the records claim, on a world whose name has been redacted from every archive. The circumstances of his discovery remain classified, and some believe there were two primarchs, twins who called themselves Alfarius and Omegan, indistinguishable and inseparable. The 20th Legion became the Alpha Legion, and they specialized in infiltration, espionage, and psychological warfare. Alfarius taught them that deception was superior to honesty, that the greatest victories were achieved without battle, and that loyalty could be a tool as much as a virtue. The Alpha Legion fought wars that no one knew had occurred, toppling governments and instigating rebellions that destabilized entire sectors before the Imperium's fleets arrived. They were the most enigmatic of the legions, trusted by no one and trusted by everyone, and their true allegiance would remain uncertain even after the heresy tore the galaxy in half. The Great Crusade reached its zenith. 200 years of continuous warfare, thousands of worlds brought into compliance, entire alien empires reduced to dust. The legions marched in unity, each one a reflection of its primarch's strengths and flaws, each one contributing to the Emperor's vision of a unified galaxy. The Ultramarines conquered with discipline and governance. The Space Wolves broke Xenos' holds with feral savagery. The Dark Angels fought in silence against foes whose names were forbidden. The Emperor's children pursued perfection on every battlefield. The Iron Warriors ground enemy fortresses into rubble. The White Scars raided and vanished. The Imperial Fists held ground no other legion could defend. The Night Lords brought compliance through terra. The Blood Angels fought with angelic fury. The Iron Hands replaced weakness with metal. The World Eaters drowned worlds in blood. The Death Guard endured toxins and plagues. The Thousand Suns wielded the warp as weapon. The Lunar Wolves led from the front with Horus's genius. The Word-Bearers spread faith disguised as loyalty. The Salamanders protected the innocent. The Raven Guard struck from shadow. The Alpha Legion undermined empires before battles began. But beneath the unity, fractures were spreading. Guilliman despised Lorgar's slowness, the word-bearer's insistence on building monuments when the Crusade demanded speed. Angron hated everyone, including himself, the nails reducing his thoughts to rage and resentment. Perturabo grew bitter as the Iron Warriors were assigned the worst sieges, while other legions claimed glory. Mortarion distrusted Magnus, viewing the Thousand Sons' sorcery as weakness disguised as enlightenment. Corax and Horus clashed over doctrine, the Raven Guard's precision conflicting with the Lunar Wolves' audacity. The Night Lords descended into atrocity, and other legions began refusing joint operations with them. The Emperor noticed these tensions but dismissed them, believing that once the Crusade was complete, the primarchs would no longer need to compete. He was wrong. The galaxy was too vast, the Crusade too long, the primarchs too flawed. They were demigods, but they were also products of the worlds that had shaped them, and those worlds had not been kind. Angron's rage would never heal. Lorgar's need for worship would never be satisfied by the Emperor's cold rationalism. Perturabo's resentment would fester until it became hatred. Magnus's arrogance would lead him to catastrophic error, and Horus, the brightest and best, would one day stand at the center of it all, the fulcrum on which the galaxy would turn. But for now, the Crusade ascended. The Emperor withdrew to Terra, leaving Horus in command, trusting his favorite son to complete the work he had begun. The legions pressed outward, claiming systems at a pace that would never be equaled. Compliance followed compliance. Xenos were driven to extinction. Human colonies were reintegrated. The Mechanicum allied with the Imperium, trading knowledge for soldiers, and Forge worlds rose across the galaxy to supply the ever-growing war machine. The Great Crusade seemed unstoppable, and in the warp, the Chaos Gods smiled, knowing that the hour of corruption was at hand. The first wound was opened on Davin. It was a feral world, unremarkable in the annals of the Great Crusade, a place of swamps and primitive tribes that had sworn fealty to the Warmaster without resistance. Horus had brought the Lunar Wolves to oversee the final stages of compliance, a gesture of reassurance to a world that had welcomed the Imperium peacefully. But Davin held secrets that even its people did not fully understand. Beneath the swamps lay temples older than human memory, structures built by civilizations that had worshipped powers dwelling beyond the veil of reality. The tribal priests spoke of spirits that granted visions and blessings, and they invited Horus to prove his worthiness in their sacred lodge. The Warmaster descended into the temple alone. What occurred in those depths would never be recorded in any official imperial account. The records speak only of an ambush, of a weapon tainted by Xenos sorcery, of Horus struck down and brought to the edge of death. His apothecaries worked desperately to save him, but the wound refused to heal, festering despite their efforts. In desperation, the lodge priests offered their own remedy, an ancient ritual that would take the Warmaster into the spirit realm where he could be healed. Horus's most trusted sons, Erebus of the Word-Bearers, who had engineered the entire trap, and others who had been corrupted slowly over years of subtle poisoning, encouraged the ritual. They assured the Lunar Wolves that it was their only hope. Horus entered the warp and emerged changed. When he woke, the wound had closed, but something fundamental had shifted behind his eyes. He no longer spoke of the Emperor with reverence. He questioned the Crusade's purpose, asked why the Space Marines should bleed for an Imperium that would be ruled by mortals once the wars ended. He spoke of betrayal, claiming that the Emperor had never intended the Primarchs to share in the glory of the realm they were building. And those who had been corrupted alongside him, the Lodge members who had been slowly turned by Chaos cultists embedded within the legions, echoed his doubts and amplified his rage. Horus did not fall in a single moment. He was seduced gradually, his pride weaponized, his love for his brothers turned into resentment toward a father who had left him to bear the Crusade's weight alone. The Warmaster made his choice. 8 legions would stand with him when the hour came, the sons of Horus, who would follow their gene father into any darkness. The Emperor's children, whose Primarch Fulgrim had been corrupted by a Slaneshi daemon blade and now pursued sensation and perfection through excess and depravity. The Iron Warriors, whose bitterness Horus had carefully cultivated, promising Perturabo the recognition he had been denied, the Night Lords, who had descended so far into atrocity that they welcomed any war that let them inflict suffering, the World Eaters, who cared nothing for politics but followed Angron because he promised them endless slaughter, the Death Guard, whom Horus had convinced that the Emperor's vision was a lie and that Mortarian's resentment was justified, the Thousand Sons, who would be forced into Horus's camp by the Emperor's own betrayal, and the Word-Bearers, who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, having turned to chaos worship decades earlier and spent the intervening years spreading their corruption. But loyalty was still strong in many hearts. Horus knew that the traitor legions contained warriors who would refuse his vision, who would remain faithful to Terra no matter the cost. These loyalists had to be eliminated before the rebellion could begin in earnest, and so Horus engineered the first great atrocity of the heresy, a purge disguised as a compliance action. He gathered his fleet at Istvan III, a world that had recently rejected imperial rule, and assembled strike forces from the 4 legions he trusted least: the Sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, and the World Eaters. But the warriors he selected for the initial assault were those he knew would never turn traitor, the captains and companies who had remained stubbornly loyal despite years of lodge corruption. They descended to the surface, unaware that they had been marked for death. The bombardment began without warning. Virus bombs fell from the sky, ancient weapons of mass extermination that the Emperor had forbidden except in the most extreme circumstances. The warheads detonated above Istvan III's cities, releasing designer plagues that killed everything organic within seconds. The loyalist space marines on the surface felt their lungs dissolve, their blood boil, their flesh slough from their bones. Even their enhanced physiology could not save them. The viruses were engineered to kill Astartes, and they did so with horrifying efficiency. Within hours, billions were dead, and the surface of Istvan III was carpeted with corpses, but some survived. Captain Garrow of the Death Guard had questioned his deployment orders and held his ship in orbit. When the bombardment began, he watched in horror as his battle brothers died screaming on the surface below. He understood immediately what had occurred, and he made the only choice available to a loyal son of the Emperor. He broke formation, fleeing into the warp with a handful of survivors, racing toward Terra to warn the Imperium of Horus's treachery. It was a journey that would take months, and by the time Garrow reached the throne world, the heresy would already be in full conflagration. On the surface of Istvan III, the survivors fought on. Not all the loyalists had died in the initial bombardment. Some had found shelter, others had resisted the virus through sheer physiological resilience, and still more had been warned by brothers who refused to participate in the slaughter. They gathered in the ruins of the planetary capital, fortifying what remained and preparing for the inevitable ground assault. They knew they could not win. They were outnumbered, cut off from support, surrounded by traitors who would show no mercy. But they were space marines, and retreat was not in their nature. They would die standing, and they would take as many traitors with them as the Emperor allowed. The battle for Istvan III lasted 3 months. The traitor legions descended in overwhelming force, expecting to crush the survivors in days. Instead, they found fortified positions manned by warriors who fought with the desperation of the damned and the skill of the Imperium's finest. Every street became a killing ground. Every building was rigged with traps. The loyalists used the ruins to their advantage, turning the traitors' numerical superiority into a liability in the confined urban warfare. Angron descended personally, leading his World Eaters in berserker charges that broke against defensive lines held by sons of the Emperor who would not yield. Fulgrim sent the Emperor's children in precise, surgical strikes, only to watch them bleed out in ambushes orchestrated by warriors who knew they were already dead. Horus watched from orbit, his frustration mounting. He had intended Istvan III to be a clean purge, a swift elimination of internal dissent before the true rebellion began. Instead, it had become a quagmire, draining resources and time he could not afford to waste. The Emperor would learn of the betrayal soon, if he had not already, and every day spent on Istvan III was a day that Terra's defenses could be strengthened. Horus considered orbital bombardment, but the presence of traitor forces on the ground made such tactics risky. Instead, he deployed the titans of the Mechanicum forces that had sided with him. God machines that strode through the ruins and annihilated fortifications with plasma and void weaponry. The end came slowly, one bunker at a time. The Loyalists sold their lives with a cost measured in traitor blood. When the last defender fell, 3 months after the first virus bomb detonated, the traitor legions had suffered casualties they could ill afford. Entire companies had been wiped out. Irreplaceable gene seed had been lost. And the delay had given the Imperium precious time to prepare. Horus had won, but the victory was hollow, and the War Master knew that his rebellion had stumbled at its very first step. But there was no turning back. The Imperium now knew of his treachery, and the Loyalist legions were already mobilizing to respond. Horus gathered his forces and withdrew to Istvan, a barren world with vast killing fields perfect for the slaughter he knew was coming. 7 Loyalist legions were en route, led by Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands, who had taken personal command of the Imperial response in the Emperor's name. Horus prepared his trap carefully, positioning his forces and sending word to legions whose loyalty was still uncertain, inviting them to join the Imperium's punitive strike. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard arrived first. They descended in a spearhead formation, confident in their numerical superiority and their righteous cause. Ferrus Manus was consumed with rage, determined to strike down the traitors personally and end the rebellion before it could spread. His fury blinded him to the possibility of deception. The 3 legions landed on Istvan's black sands and advanced toward the traitor positions, supported by 4 additional legions that had arrived moments later: the Iron Warriors, the Wordbearers, the Night Lords, and the Alpha Legion. 7 Loyalist legions against 8 traitors. The odds were poor, but not impossible. Then the second wave opened fire. The Iron Warriors, Wordbearers, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion turned their guns on the Loyalists they had claimed to support. The ambush was total and devastating. The Raven Guard and Salamanders, positioned at the flanks, were caught in a crossfire that annihilated entire companies in seconds. The Iron Hands, at the spearhead, found themselves surrounded and cut off from retreat. Ferrus Manus fought his way toward Fulgrim, his oldest friend, believing that if he could reach the Emperor's children's primarch, he could end the madness through personal combat. They met on the slopes of the Urgal Depression. The duel was brief and brutal. Fulgrim fought with a daemon blade that sang with warp energies, and Ferrus Manus wielded a hammer forged in the fires of Medusa. They had sparred 1,000 times during the Great Crusade, brothers testing each other's skill in friendship. Now they fought to kill, and the techniques they had shared became weapons turned against each other. Fulgrim was faster, his movements accelerated by the demon whispering in his mind. Ferrus was stronger, his necrodermis arms lending his blows a weight that cracked the earth. But speed triumphed over strength. Fulgrim's blade severed Ferrus's head in a single stroke, and the Primarch of the Iron Hands fell, his gene sons watching in horror as their father's body collapsed to the black sand. The Loyalists broke. Without Ferrus, without hope of reinforcement, the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard fled toward their landing zones, only to find them already overrun by traitor forces. The slaughter continued into the night, the black sands of Istvan turning slick with blood and oil. Vulcan of the Salamanders was surrounded and beaten nearly to death, his survival a miracle that even he could not explain. Corax of the Raven Guard fought his way clear with a fraction of his legion, escaping into the void with barely enough warriors to crew his flagship. The Iron Hands were shattered, leaderless, and broken, scattered across the galaxy in fragments that would never fully reunite. Istvan became a graveyard. The traitors left the bodies where they fell, a monument to treachery and the death of brotherhood. The sands remained black, stained by the blood of gene sons who had trusted their allies and paid for that trust with annihilation. The Dropsite massacre, as it would be known, marked the true beginning of the heresy. The Imperium could no longer pretend this was a localized rebellion. 8 legions had declared for Horus. 7 remained loyal, but 3 of those had been crippled in a single engagement. The galaxy was on fire, and there would be no swift resolution. While Istvan burned, another war erupted on the far side of the galaxy. Magnus the Red, primarch of the Thousand Sons, had discovered Horus's treachery through his psychic mastery. He had witnessed the corruption in visions, seen the path the War Master would take, and knew that terra had to be warned. But Magnus had been forbidden from using sorcery by the Emperor, admonished at the Council of Nicaea, and ordered to disband his librarius. Magnus ignored the edict. He believed the threat was too great to obey outdated restrictions. He cast a spell of such magnitude that it tore through the warp and manifested directly in the Emperor's throne room on Terra, shattering the psychic wards the Emperor had been constructing to shield humanity from the predations of chaos. The Emperor was furious. Magnus had meant to save the Imperium, but his recklessness had destroyed the Webway project, the Emperor's secret attempt to free humanity from warp travel and the dangers it entailed. Decades of work, obliterated in an instant. The Emperor saw only betrayal, a son who had disobeyed a direct command and unleashed catastrophic consequences. He ordered the Space Wolves to deploy to Prospero, Magnus's home world, with instructions to bring the Primarch back to Terra in chains to answer for his crimes. Lemon Russ received a different message. Horus intercepted the Emperor's command and altered it, twisting the order from capture to extermination. The Space Wolves, already suspicious of the Thousand Sons' sorcery, believed they were following the Emperor's will when they launched their assault on Prospero. They arrived in overwhelming force, accompanied by Custodian Guard and Sisters of Silence, anti-psychers whose presence nullified the Thousand Sons' greatest strength. Russ broadcast a final demand for Magnus to surrender, but Magnus had seen this moment in his visions and believed it was his punishment for hubris. He forbade his sons from defending Prospero, ordering them to accept their fate. The Thousand Sons disobeyed. They fought with desperation and sorcery, hurling warp fire and telekinetic waves against the Space Wolves' advance. The city of Tizca, a marvel of crystalline spires and libraries containing knowledge gathered across the Great Crusade, burned under the wolves' assault. The Space Wolves fought without mercy, killing Thousand Sons who pleaded for understanding, who tried to explain that they were loyal, that this was a mistake. Russ did not listen. He had been given his orders, and he carried them out with the savage efficiency that had made him the Emperor's executioner. Magnus watched from his tower as his world died. When he could bear it no longer, when the last of his son's screams echoed through the warp, he broke his silence and fought back. He confronted Russ personally, the two primarchs clashing in a duel that shattered mountains and tore the sky. Magnus was the stronger psyker, but Russ was the superior warrior, and the Sisters of Silence weakened Magnus's powers with their anti-psychic presence. Russ drove his blade through Magnus's chest, shattering the Primarch's physical form and forcing his essence into the warp. In that moment of desperation, Magnus made his final choice. He called out to the only powers that would answer, and the Chaos Gods responded with open arms. They rebuilt his body, transformed his sons into something more and less than human, and welcomed the Thousand Sons into their service. Magnus had intended to save the Imperium, and instead his actions had delivered an entire legion to chaos. Prospero was left in ruins, the libraries burned, the survivors scattered into the warp. The Space Wolves returned to Terra, believing they had carried out the Emperor's will, unaware that they had been manipulated into destroying one of the Imperium's most loyal legions. On the other side of the galaxy, another betrayal unfolded. The Word-Bearers, who had spent decades preparing for this moment, launched a surprise assault on Calth, the primary mustering world of the Ultramarines. The attack was coordinated with precision that spoke to years of planning. The Word-Bearers' fleet emerged from the warp in Calth's orbit and immediately opened fire on the Ultramarines' ships, crippling dozens before the alarm could even be raised. On the surface, Word-Bearers who had been invited as allies turned their weapons on their Ultramarine hosts, murdering them in the midst of joint planning sessions and ceremonial gatherings. Robute Gilliman survived the initial assassination attempt by seconds. He rallied his sons and organized a defense, but the Word-Bearers had already seized key installations and were bombarding the surface with weapons designed to ignite Calth's atmosphere. The skies turned to fire. Entire cities were consumed in the conflagration. The Ultramarines fought back with discipline and fury. but they were outnumbered and caught completely off guard. Guilliman led counterattacks that drove the word-bearers back step by bloody step, but the damage was catastrophic. Calth would burn for years, and the war would continue in the lightless caverns beneath the surface, a grinding struggle of attrition that would drain both legions. The word-bearers had achieved their objective. They had pinned the Ultramarines, the largest and most disciplined of the Loyalist legions, to a single system, preventing Guilliman from reinforcing terra or responding to crises elsewhere in the Imperium. The heresy had fragmented the Imperium's defenders, isolating them, turning brother against brother, and ensuring that when Horus finally moved on terra, the Emperor would face him with only a fraction of his forces. The galaxy burned. Compliance worlds rose in rebellion as word-bearers' preachers revealed their true allegiance and turned populations to chaos worship. The Night Lords descended on frontier systems, terrorizing worlds into submission through atrocity. The Iron Warriors besieged fortress worlds that remained loyal, grinding them to dust with methodical brutality. The Alpha Legion infiltrated command structures and turned loyalist forces against each other through misinformation and sabotage, and the World Eaters simply killed, following Angron from world to world, leaving nothing but corpses and ash. The traitor legions changed. Exposure to the warp and the blessings of the Chaos Gods twisted them into something no longer fully human. The Emperor's children descended into depravity, their armor adorned with obscene icons, their flesh mutated by their pursuit of sensation. The Death Guard's endurance became rot, their bodies bloating with disease even as they continued to fight. The Thousand Suns were reduced to dust contained within their armor, sorcerous automatons animated by the spells of their remaining psychers. The word-bearers covered themselves in scripture written in blood, chanting litanies to dark gods. The World Eaters implanted more nails, accepting brain damage in exchange for greater fury. The Night Lords abandoned any pretense of justice, becoming sadists who killed for pleasure. The Iron Warriors grew colder, replacing more of their flesh with machinery until they were barely distinguishable from their weapons. The Sons of Horus were marked with the 8-pointed star of chaos, becoming heralds of the War Master's new order. The Loyalists endured. The Dark Angels fought in isolation, unaware of the full scope of the heresy, their primarchs refusing to commit fully to either Terra's defense or the pursuit of the traitors. The White Scars were divided, their loyalty uncertain until Jaghatai Khan made his choice and purged the traitors from his own ranks. The Imperial Fists fortified Terra, Rogel Dawn turning the Imperial Palace into the greatest fortress in the galaxy. The Blood Angels held distant systems, their gene curse worsening as the warp storms intensified. The Salamanders rebuilt in secret, Vulcan lost and presumed dead. The Raven Guard hid in the shadows, conducting guerrilla warfare against traitor supply lines, and the Ultramarines fought their war beneath Calth, isolated but unbroken. The Imperium had shattered into civil war, and there would be no peace until one side lay destroyed. 7 years the galaxy burned before Horus turned his gaze toward Terra. 7 years of brother killing brother, of worlds reduced to ash, of the Imperium fracturing into 1,000 isolated war zones where no reinforcement would come and no mercy would be given. The traitor legions had grown stronger through their embrace of chaos, their flesh twisted by warp blessings, their weapons singing with demonic energies. But time was their enemy. Every day the heresy continued was a day the Loyalists could fortify, regroup, reorganize. Horus knew that if he allowed the war to drag on indefinitely, the Imperium would strangle his rebellion through sheer attrition. The Emperor still commanded vast resources, still held Terra and Mars, still inspired loyalty across 1,000,000 worlds. The War Master needed a decisive stroke, a blow so catastrophic that the Imperium would collapse regardless of how many systems remained theoretically loyal. He would strike at the throne world itself. The armada that gathered for the assault was the largest fleet ever assembled in human history. Thousands of warships, from Gloriana-class flagships that could crack continents to swarms of raiders and system monitors pressed into service. The Sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Word-Bearers, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, and the Alpha Legion contributed their fleets, alongside traitor elements of the Imperial Army, corrupted Mechanicum forces, and demonic entities summoned from the warp to serve as shock troops. The fleet translated into the Sol system in a wave of unreality that sent psychic shockwaves across Terra, announcing Horus's arrival with a declaration that could not be ignored. The outer defenses fell within hours. The traitors swept aside the monitor stations and orbital fortresses that guarded the system's edge, overwhelming them through sheer numbers and the raw power of warp-enhanced weaponry. The defenders fought desperately, buying time with their lives, broadcasting warnings to Terra even as their ships were torn apart. By the time the traitor fleet reached the inner system, Terra's defenders knew exactly what was coming, and Rogel Dawn had already begun the final preparations. The Imperial Palace had been transformed. Dawn had spent years turning the Emperor's seat of power into a fortress that could withstand any assault imaginable. The walls were layered ceramite and adamantium, meters thick, studded with weapon emplacements that could track targets in orbit. The entire palace complex covered thousands of square kilometers, a city fortress that housed billions of defenders. The Imperial Fists manned the walls alongside regiments of the Imperial Army, Mechanicum battle servitors, and whatever loyalist forces had managed to reach Terra before the siege began. The Blood Angels held the Eternity Gate, the massive portal that led to the inner sanctum. The White Scars ranged across the outer districts, launching lightning raids against traitor landing zones. Custodian Guard, the Emperor's personal bodyguards, stood ready at the innermost defenses, the last line between Horus and the Golden Throne. The Emperor himself had withdrawn into the Imperial dungeon. He could not leave. The disaster on Prospero, Magnus's reckless shattering of the psychic wards, had torn open the webway beneath the palace and unleashed a demonic invasion that would have consumed Terra if the Emperor had not personally sealed the breach. He sat upon the Golden Throne, a psychic engine of unimaginable power, and held the gateway closed through sheer force of will. Every second he sat there was agony measured in lifetimes. Daemons clawed at the barrier he maintained, seeking any weakness, any moment of faltering. He could not command the defense, could not lead his armies, could not even leave the throne room without condemning Terra to annihilation. The Imperium's master had become its prisoner, and the defense of humanity's cradle fell to his sons. The bombardment began at dawn. The traitor fleet opened fire from orbit, raining lance strikes and macro cannon shells onto the palace's shields. The shields held, powered by reactors buried kilometers beneath the surface, but the barrage was relentless. Day and night ceased to have meaning as the sky burned with the constant flash of munitions. The palace's weapon batteries returned fire, claiming traitor ships with every salvo, but for every vessel destroyed, 10 more took its place. The void above Terra became a graveyard of burning hulks and debris, but the bombardment continued without pause. Then the drop pods fell, millions of them, descending through the firestorm like meteors, slamming into the palace's outer districts with impacts that registered on seismographs across the continent. The traitor legions disgorged from the pods in a tide of corrupted ceramite and roaring chain blades. The World Eaters charged without strategy or hesitation, throwing themselves at the walls with berserker fury. The Iron Warriors advanced methodically, establishing firing positions and bringing forward siege artillery that pounded specific sections of wall until they crumbled. The Night Lords dropped into civilian sectors, spreading terror through the refugee populations that had fled into the palace for protection. The Death Guard trudged through artillery fire that would have obliterated mortal soldiers, their bloated bodies absorbing hits that should have been fatal. The Loyalists met them at every wall. The Imperial Fists held the ramparts with discipline that bordered on fanaticism. They died standing, refusing to yield even a meter of ground without exacting a cost measured in traitor blood. When ammunition ran low, they drew their chainswords. When their blades broke, they fought with combat knives. When their knives shattered, they used their armored fists. Dawn had taught them that retreat was dishonor, and they obeyed that teaching unto death. The walls were carpeted with bodies, loyalist and traitor alike, the dead piled so high in some sections that attackers had to climb over their own fallen to reach the defenders. The Blood Angels fought with savage beauty. Sanguinius led them personally, his golden armor stained red with traitor blood, his wings casting shadows across the battlefield as he descended again and again into the thickest fighting. The red thirst had taken many of his sons, turning them into howling berserkers who fought alongside the controlled fury of their brothers. The black rage had not yet fully manifested, but its seeds were present, visions of their primarch's future death driving some blood angels into suicidal charges. Sanguinius felt his gene curse spreading through his legion and knew it was accelerating, fed by the warp taint saturating Terra's atmosphere. He fought with desperate grace, trying to be everywhere at once, inspiring his sons through his presence even as he felt the weight of prophecy pressing down on him. The white scars refused to be pinned. Jagatai Khan led his legion in constant motion, racing across the palace's vast expanse on bikes and gunships, striking at traitor staging areas and vanishing before reinforcements could respond. They burned supply depots, assassinated commanders, and sowed confusion in the traitor rear lines. The Khan knew that the siege would not be won through static defense alone. The traitors had numbers and momentum. The loyalists needed to disrupt their cohesion, force them to commit resources to protecting their own positions rather than pressing the assault. The white scars became ghosts, appearing without warning and disappearing into the smoke-choked ruins before retaliation could be organized. For 55 days the siege ground on. The walls were breached, reclaimed, and breached again. Entire districts of the palace fell to the traitors, only to be retaken in desperate counterattacks that cost both sides thousands of casualties. The Death Guard reached the Lion's Gate, one of the palace's primary entrances, and held it against Imperial Fist counterattacks for 3 days, before being driven back by a Blood Angel's assault, led by Sanguinius himself. The Emperor's children breached the Saturnine Wall through treachery, using captured Imperial army units to open a gate from within, but the Custodian Guard responded and annihilated the intruders in close combat, so brutal that even the Emperor's children fled. The World Eaters reached the ultimate gate. Angron led them personally. The Primarch transformed into something barely recognizable as the warrior who had once fought as a slave on New Syria. He had ascended to daemonhood, his body a mass of brass and bleeding flesh, wings of shadow spreading from his back. He wielded axes that dripped with warp fire, and his mere presence drove his sons into frenzies of violence that eclipsed even their usual savagery. The World Eaters threw themselves at the ultimate gate in human waves, accepting staggering casualties for incremental gains. The Imperial Fists held them for days, but the pressure was relentless, and eventually the gate began to buckle. Sanguinius came to reinforce the defense. The Angel and the Daemon met in single combat while their sons tore each other apart around them. Angron was stronger, empowered by his ascension, sustained by the endless rage that had defined his existence, but Sanguinius was still mortal, still sane, and he fought with a clarity that the Daemon Primarch had long since abandoned. The duel raged across the ruins of the ultimate gate, 2 demigods locked in combat that shattered stone and bent reality. Sanguinius's blade found Angron's throat, and for a moment the Demon Primarch staggered. Then he laughed, a sound like breaking metal, and his wound closed. He could not be truly killed, not here in the Materium. But Sanguinius had bought time. The Blood Angels rallied and drove the World Eaters back, and the ultimate gate held. But the cost was unspeakable. The Loyalist forces were bleeding out. Casualties mounted faster than reinforcements could arrive from the inner districts. Gene seed supplies were nearly exhausted. Ammunition was rationed to the point that some defenders fought with salvaged traitor weapons. The civilians sheltering in the palace's depths were dying of starvation and disease, the infrastructure unable to support the billions packed into spaces meant for millions. The dead were piled in catacombs and burned in mass pyres when fuel permitted. The wounded were triaged with brutal efficiency, those beyond saving given the Emperor's peace to conserve medical supplies for warriors who could still fight. Dawn stood on the walls and calculated their remaining time. His strategic mind, honed over centuries of warfare, told him that the palace would fall within weeks unless something changed. The traitors had momentum, resources, and the blessings of dark gods. The Loyalists had only walls and determination, and walls could be broken. determination exhausted. Reinforcements were coming. Guilliman was fighting his way through the warp with the Ultramarines. Russ was en route with what remained of the Space Wolves. The Dark Angels were finally committing to Terra's defense, but they would arrive too late. The palace would fall before they could break through the traitor blockade. Then the shields failed, not through enemy action, but through simple depletion. The reactors powering the palace's void shields had been running at maximum output for 55 days without pause. They overheated, their coolant systems failing, their machine spirits driven to exhaustion. The shields flickered and died, and for the first time since the siege began, Terra's sky was open. The traitor fleet ceased orbital bombardment and began landing heavier forces. Titans descended on dropships the size of hive blocks, god machines that strode through the palace districts, crushing defenders beneath their feet. Super heavy tanks rolled off landing craft, their cannons reducing fortifications to rubble. The traitors surged forward with renewed fury, sensing that the endgame was at hand. The Eternity Gate became the final bastion. It was the entrance to the Sanctum Imperialis, the innermost section of the palace where the Emperor maintained the Golden Throne. If the Eternity Gate fell, the traitors would reach the Emperor himself, and the Imperium would die. Sanguinius took personal command of the defense, ordering the Blood Angels to hold regardless of cost. They obeyed without question, knowing they were being asked to die. The gate was a choke point, massive beyond comprehension, its doors tall enough that Titans could march through in formation. The Blood Angels fortified the approaches, turning the plaza before the gate into a kill zone layered with mines, barricades, and interlocking fields of fire. The Death Guard came first. They trudged through the kill zone without flinching, their decaying bodies absorbing wounds that would have stopped other warriors. Mortarion walked at their head, transformed into a demon prince of Nurgle, his scythe reaping blood angels by the dozen. The Death Guard reached the gate and began pounding it with siege hammers and melter charges, working with methodical patience to break through. The Blood Angels counterattacked, slamming into the Death Guard with chain blades and combat shields, fighting in the shadow of the gate itself. The battle devolved into a grinding melee, both sides too committed to retreat, too proud to yield. Sanguinius dueled Mortarion on the steps of the Eternity Gate. The Angel's sword clashed against the Daemon Primarch's scythe, each strike releasing bursts of warp energy that burned the eyes of mortals who witnessed it. Mortarion was death incarnate, his every breath releasing plagues that ate through ceramite and flesh alike. Sanguinius was life-defiant, his wings spreading wide, his blade burning with psychic fire. The duel lasted hours, neither Primarch able to gain a decisive advantage, until finally Sanguinius drove his sword through Mortarion's chest and banished the Daemon Prince back into the warp. The Death Guard faltered, leaderless, and the Blood Angels drove them back from the gate. But Sanguinius was wounded. The plagues had touched him, eating at his armor, weakening his flesh. His wings were torn, feathers missing, the pristine white stained with blood, and worse. He stood on the steps of the Eternity Gate and knew that he would not survive the siege. He had seen his death in visions, had known for years how he would fall, but knowing did not make it easier. He looked at his sons, saw the madness spreading through their ranks, the red thirst claiming more with every passing hour, and he wept for what they would become. Then the vengeful spirit appeared in orbit. Horus's flagship, a vessel so massive it could be seen from the surface with the naked eye, settled into position above the palace. Its shields lowered, its weapon batteries went silent. A signal transmitted across all frequencies, a message from the War Master to the Emperor. Horus invited his father to board the vengeful spirit for single combat. If the Emperor won, the traitors would withdraw. If Horus won, the Imperium would kneel to the new order. It was a challenge that defied strategic logic, a personal duel to decide the fate of the galaxy. The Emperor knew it was a trap. Horus would not have lowered his shields unless he was certain of victory. The vengeful spirit would be filled with traps, ambushes, demonic entities waiting to strike. But the Emperor also knew that the palace was hours from falling, that his sons were dying, that the Golden Throne was failing. If he remained, terror would burn. If he went, there was at least a chance, however slim, of ending the war before the Imperium collapsed entirely. He rose from the Golden Throne, leaving it in the care of Malcador the Sigillite, his oldest and most trusted advisor. Malcador took the Emperor's place, his mortal frame barely able to contain the energies required to hold the webway closed. He would die within hours, his body consumed by the effort, but he bought the Emperor time. The Emperor teleported aboard the vengeful spirit with a strike force of custodian guard, imperial fists, and blood angels. Sanguinius came despite his wounds, refusing to let his father face Horus alone. Dawn came because he would not abandon the Emperor, even if it meant leaving the palace's defense to others. They materialized in the depths of the flagship, and immediately the ambush began. Daemons poured from the walls, warp entities given form by the ship's corruption. The custodian guard fought them back, their guardian spears burning with psychic fire, but the daemons were endless. The strike force pushed forward, fighting through corridors that shifted and changed, reality bending under the weight of chaos's presence. Sanguinius reached Horus first. The War Master waited in the flagship's throne room, a cathedral-like space where he had once commanded the Great Crusade. Now it was a blasphemous temple, the walls covered in sigils of chaos, the air thick with warp energies. Horus had been transformed, his armor fused to his flesh, his eyes burning with power granted by all four chaos gods. He was a conduit for their will, a mortal elevated to godhood, and when Sanguinius looked upon him, the angels saw nothing of the brother he had once loved. They fought without words. Sanguinius was wounded, exhausted, dying from the plagues Mortarion had inflicted. Horus was empowered beyond measure, sustained by gods, wielding a mace that could shatter ceramite with a touch. The duel was brief. Sanguinius fought with everything he had, his blade finding Horus's armor again and again, but the War Master's wounds healed instantly, his dark patrons refusing to let him fall. Horus's mace caught Sanguinius in the chest, crushing the primarch's breastplate and breaking the bones beneath. The angel fell, his wings spreading across the floor, his blood pooling beneath him. Horus stood over his brother and wept. For a moment, the corruption faltered. For a moment, Horus remembered who he had been, what he had lost. Then the Chaos Gods reasserted their grip, and the War Master crushed Sanguinius's throat beneath his boot, ending the angel's life with a final act of desecration. The Emperor arrived seconds later. He saw his son's broken body and understood that there would be no reasoning with the War Master, no negotiation, no redemption. Horus had gone too far, surrendered too much to chaos. The Emperor unleashed his full psychic might, power enough to destroy suns, and Horus met him with the strength of four gods channeled through a single vessel. The throne room became a battlefield where reality itself fractured. The walls melted, the floor cracked open to reveal the warp beneath, and the two greatest beings in the galaxy fought for the future of mankind. The duel raged for subjective eternities. Time had no meaning in that place. The Emperor struck with lightning that burned hotter than stars. Horus countered with warp fire that consumed matter and soul alike. They grappled, and the ship groaned, its structure failing under the strain. The Emperor was stronger, older, wiser, but Horus had the backing of gods who fed him endless power. The Emperor began to falter, his ancient body sustaining wounds that even his regeneration could not fully heal. Then, a custodian guard, loyal unto death, charged forward to protect his master. Horus obliterated him with a gesture, his body and soul annihilated so completely that he had never existed. The casual cruelty of it, the utter disregard for a life given in service, broke through the last of the Emperor's restraint. He saw that Horus was truly lost, that no fragment of his beloved son remained. The Emperor gathered his strength and unleashed a psychic attack so devastating that it tore Horus's soul from his body and cast it into the warp, where the Chaos Gods fought over the fragments like carrion birds. Horus died, screaming his father's name. The Emperor collapsed beside his fallen sons, his body shattered beyond repair. The custodian guard found him minutes later and carried him back to Terra, racing through teleportation corridors as the vengeful spirit began to break apart. The traitor fleet, leaderless and demoralized, fled into the warp. The siege was over, Terra was saved, but the Emperor was dying. He was placed upon the Golden Throne, the same device that had sustained him during the siege, and it became his eternal prison. His body could not heal, could not move, could barely sustain life, but his mind endured, vast and terrible, holding back the tides of chaos through sheer will. He became a corpse god, neither alive nor dead, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every day whose souls were fed into the throne to maintain its function. The Imperium was saved, but its master was lost. Guilliman arrived days later with the Ultramarines and found Terra in ruins, the palace a graveyard, the Emperor entombed. The primarch looked upon the devastation and understood that the Imperium could never be whole again. Too much had been destroyed, too much had been lost. The legions were shattered, their strength spent, their numbers decimated. The dream of unity was dead, killed on the black sands of Istvan and in the throne room of the vengeful spirit. Guilliman made a decision that would reshape the Imperium for 10 millennia. He authored the Codex Astartes, a comprehensive document that mandated the dissolution of the Space Marine legions into smaller, autonomous chapters. No single commander would ever again wield the power of an entire legion. No primarch would command 10,000 warriors. The legions would be broken into chapters of 1,000, spread across the galaxy, each one independent but bound by shared doctrine and gene lineage. It was a safeguard against future rebellion, an insurance policy written in the blood of the heresy. The second founding began. The Ultramarines divided into dozens of chapters: the Genesis chapter, the Nova Marines, the Aurora chapter, and more. The Imperial Fists split into the Crimson Fists and Black Templars. The Blood Angels became the Flesh Tearers and Blood Drinkers. The Dark Angels spawned the Angels of Absolution and Angels of Redemption, though they maintained secret ties that violated the spirit of the Codex. The Iron Hands fractured into the Brazen Claws and Red Talons. The White Scars birthed the Storm Lords and Marauders. The Salamanders and Raven Guard, too diminished to split extensively, created a handful of successor chapters, but remained close to their original strength. Not all accepted the Codex. The Space Wolves refused to divide, arguing that their culture could not be maintained in smaller formations. Guilliman allowed the exception reluctantly, and the Wolves remained a unified chapter, oversized but tolerated. The Black Templars rejected the Codex's limitations on fleet size and recruitment, embarking on an eternal crusade that would last 10,000 years. The Dark Angels paid lip service to the Codex, but maintained secret coordination between their successors, hunting the fallen across the galaxy in violation of every principle Guilliman had written. The galaxy entered a new age, the age of the Imperium, an era of slow decay and endless war, where the dream of unity was a distant memory and survival became the only goal. The Space Marine chapters spread across the stars, each one a bastion against the darkness, each one carrying the genetic and cultural legacy of legions that no longer existed. The heresy was over, but its scars would never heal. The Imperium did not collapse after the siege of Terra, but it never truly recovered. The second founding dispersed the remaining loyalist legions across the galaxy, transforming them from unified armies into scattered fragments, bound only by shared gene lineage and the distant memory of their primarchs. The chapters established fortress monasteries on worlds both civilized and feral, recruiting from populations that had never known the Great Crusade, teaching doctrines inherited from gene fathers who had vanished into legend or death. The Space Marines became mythic figures, angels of death who appeared when worlds faced annihilation and departed as soon as victory was achieved. They were no longer conquerors building an empire. They were wardens holding back an endless tide, and the tide was rising. The galaxy had been wounded too deeply to heal. The warp storms that had raged during the heresy did not fully subside. Travel between stars remained dangerous, entire sectors cut off for centuries at a time. Xenos races that had been driven to the brink during the Great Crusade returned with renewed strength, reclaiming worlds the Imperium could no longer defend. Orc empires rose in the galactic east, their wargs sweeping across human space like green tsunamis. The Eldar, reduced to craft worlds and hidden enclaves, struck from the webway at targets only they understood. And from the Eye of Terror, The traitor legions launched raids and invasions, bringing corruption and slaughter to worlds that had believed themselves safe. The Blood Angels fought their war against themselves. The red thirst that had haunted them since their creation worsened with every generation, their gene seed carrying a flaw that could not be excised. Some fell to it completely, becoming monsters who drank the blood of friend and foe alike, lost to a hunger that no amount of carnage could satisfy. The chapter established the protocols to contain such brothers, locking them in stasis or deploying them in death companies where they could die with honor. But the true curse revealed itself only after Sanguinius's death became known throughout the Legion. The Black Rage manifested, a psychic echo of the Primarchs' final moments that drove Blood Angels into madness, their minds trapped in visions of Horus's betrayal, fighting and dying as Sanguinius had fought and died. The flaw spread to their successor chapters. The Flesh Tearers suffered worst of all, their gene seed degrading faster than any other lineage. They became savage beyond measure. Barely able to restrain themselves in battle, their chaplains forced to execute brothers who succumbed to the thirst mid-combat. The Blood Drinkers embraced ritual bloodletting, believing they could manage the curse through controlled indulgence. The Angels Vermilion went further, establishing blood tribute systems on their recruitment worlds, demanding payment in vitae from populations that came to view the chapter as vampiric overlords. Each successor found their own way to endure, but none found a cure. The flaw was woven into their genetic code. Sanguinius's gift and curse intertwined, and it would remain until the last Blood Angel fell. The Dark Angels carried a different burden. When the Lion had departed to join the defense of Terra, he left his legion divided. Half had accompanied him. The other half, under the command of Luther, remained on Caliban to continue recruiting and training. But Caliban had been touched by the same warp corruption that had spawned the monsters the Lion had fought in his youth, and Luther's isolation bred resentment. He began to believe that the Lion had abandoned Caliban, that the Emperor valued conquest over the homeworld's welfare. When the heresy erupted, Luther made a choice that would damn his name for eternity. He declared for neither side, keeping Caliban neutral, waiting to see which faction would triumph before committing his forces. The Lion returned to Caliban after the siege and found betrayal. Luther's forces had fortified the planet, turning it into a fortress that rivaled Terra itself. The confrontation between Gene Father and Fallen Son erupted into civil war, Dark Angels fighting Dark Angels in the forests and fortress monasteries where the Legion had been born. The Lion confronted Luther personally, and their duel tore reality itself. The planet shattered, its surface consumed by warp storms, and when the destruction ended, Luther was found weeping in the ruins, the Lion vanished, and Caliban reduced to a broken asteroid field. The Dark Angels recovered what they could, establishing the Rock, a fragment of Caliban converted into a mobile fortress monastery, and began their eternal hunt for the fallen, those Dark Angels who had sided with Luther and been scattered across time and space by the planet's destruction. The hunt became obsession. The Dark Angels and their successors, the Angels of Absolution, Angels of Redemption, Angels of Vengeance, and dozens more coordinated in secret, violating the Codex Astartes' principles of independence to pursue the fallen wherever they appeared. They abandoned battlefields mid-campaign if a fallen was detected elsewhere. They interrogated and executed anyone who learned of the betrayal, including Imperial officials and even other Space Marines. The Inner Circle, the highest ranks of the chapter's command structure, knew the full truth and guarded it with fanatical devotion, understanding that if the Imperium learned that half the First Legion had turned traitor, the Dark Angels' honor would be forever stained. The Space Wolves remained defiant. They rejected the Codex Astartes in all but name, maintaining their great companies as semi-independent warbands that operated more like the old Legion than the prescribed chapter structure. They recruited exclusively from Fenris, subjecting aspirants to trials that killed 9 out of 10 candidates. Those who survived were implanted with gene seed that carried the Canis Helix, a genetic marker that granted enhanced senses and ferocity, but also risked mutation into the Wolfen, Space Marines who devolved into bestial savagery. The Space Wolves accepted this risk, believing that controlled mutation was preferable to the sterile purity other chapters pursued. They adorned their armor with pelts and totems, drank and feasted between campaigns, and maintained traditions that seemed barbaric to other chapters, but which bound them together with loyalty stronger than any indoctrination. They clashed with the Inquisition more than once. The months of shame began when the Space Wolves defended civilians who had been tainted by chaos exposure, refusing to allow the Inquisition to execute populations wholesale. The Grey Knights, the Imperium's daemon hunters, were deployed to enforce the Inquisition's will, and the two chapters fought a brief but brutal conflict that nearly erupted into full civil war. The dispute was resolved through negotiation, but the Space Wolves never forgot, and their distrust of the Inquisition became legendary. They were the Emperor's executioners still, but they chose their targets according to their own honor code, not the dictates of distant bureaucrats. The Ultramarines became the backbone of the Imperium. Guilliman's gene seed proved the most stable, its flaws minimal compared to other lineages. The Ultramarines and their successors proliferated, accounting for more than half of all Space Marine chapters by the 41st millennium. They followed the Codex Astartes with religious devotion, treating Guilliman's writings as sacred scripture. Their fortress monastery on Macragge became a pilgrimage site, and their primarchs' teachings spread across the Imperium, codifying tactics and organizational structures that would define space marine warfare for 10,000 years. The Ultramarines were reliable, disciplined, adaptable, the ideal space marines according to Imperial doctrine. But their very success bred resentment among other chapters, who viewed them as arrogant and self-righteous, too quick to lecture, and too slow to acknowledge that other methods could be equally valid. The Iron Hands embraced their hatred of weakness. Ferrus Manus's death on Istvan V left them leaderless and broken, scattered across the galaxy in small warbands. When they reunited, they found themselves unable to agree on leadership, their Primarch's demise having shattered their command structure beyond repair. They formed the Council of Iron, a collective leadership where no single captain held absolute authority, and they turned inward, replacing more of their flesh with machinery in a futile attempt to purge the weakness that had allowed their gene father to die. The Iron Hands and their successors became cold, pragmatic, willing to sacrifice allies if it meant achieving tactical superiority. They calculated acceptable losses with machine precision and felt no remorse when those calculations required abandoning entire regiments to certain death. The Salamanders carried Vulcan's compassion into an uncaring galaxy. They remained the smallest of the first founding chapters, their slow recruitment and high standards limiting their numbers. But what they lacked in quantity they compensated for in dedication. The Salamanders fought to protect Imperial civilians, even when military doctrine suggested abandonment was more efficient. They held ground to evacuate populations, risked their lives to shield refugees, and refused to accept that collateral damage was inevitable. Other chapters considered them soft, too sentimental, but the Salamanders endured. They crafted their own armor and weapons in the forges of Nocturne, each piece a masterwork that reflected their Primarch's belief that creation was as sacred as destruction. The Raven Guard became ghosts. Corax had departed into the Eye of Terra after the heresy, seeking penance for failures real and imagined, and the Raven Guard were left to carry on without him. They specialized in stealth and precision, striking from unexpected angles and vanishing before retaliation could be organized. Their gene seed carried flaws that caused mutations, pale skin, black eyes, malfunctioning mucranoids, but these defects did not impair combat effectiveness, and the chapter accepted them as the price of their heritage. The Raven Guard fought the Imperium's shadow wars, assassinating Xeno's leaders, sabotaging enemy supply lines, and gathering intelligence that more conventional chapters could not obtain. The Black Templars rejected every limitation. They had been founded during the Second Founding as a successor to the Imperial Fists, but their first High Marshal, Sigismund, had no intention of following the Codex's restrictions. The Black Templars embarked on an eternal crusade, dividing their chapter into crusade fleets that roamed the galaxy seeking enemies to destroy. They recruited continuously, operating far above the 1,000-warrior limit prescribed by the Codex, justifying the excess by claiming they were always in active combat and thus required constant reinforcement. The Black Templars were zealots, among the few chapters that openly revered the Emperor as divine, and they brought fire and faith to every campaign, accepting no surrender and offering no mercy. The Imperium endured through inertia and faith. 10,000 years of war, each century bringing new threats, new rebellions, new disasters. The War of the Beast nearly destroyed the Imperium when an orc warlord of unprecedented size and cunning united the greenskin race and laid siege to Terra itself. The Space Marines responded in force, multiple chapters coordinating in a manner not seen since the heresy. And the beast was slain, but the cost was catastrophic. Entire chapters were annihilated, their gene seed lost, their names recorded in the scrolls of honored dead. The Badab War tested the Imperium's unity. The Astral Claws, a chapter tasked with defending the Badab sector, declared independence after years of being denied reinforcements and resources. They allied with other chapters who shared their grievances. And for a decade the Imperium was embroiled in civil war as loyalist chapters were deployed to crush the rebellion. The Astral Claws and their allies fought with desperation and skill, but the Imperium's resources were too vast. The rebellion was crushed, the Astral Claws reduced to a handful of survivors who fled into the Maelstrom and became the Red Corsairs, a warband of renegades who would raid Imperial space for millennia. The Black Crusades erupted from the Eye of Terror with horrifying regularity. Abaddon the Despoiler, Warmaster of Chaos and the greatest of Horus's surviving sons, led 12 major invasions over 10,000 years, each one probing the Imperium's defenses, claiming territory and relics before withdrawing into the warp. The Space Marines bore the brunt of these assaults, deploying across the Cadian Gate to hold back the tide. The Black Templars fought alongside the Imperial Fists, the Ultramarines coordinated with the White Scars, and even rival chapters set aside feuds to face the common enemy. But each Black Crusade bled the Imperium, claimed worlds that could never be reclaimed, and proved that the traitors had not been defeated, merely delayed. Gene seed degradation became a slow crisis. Over millennia, the genetic material used to create Space Marines deteriorated, mutations accumulating, flaws amplifying. Some chapters maintained purity through rigorous testing and culling of defective gene seed. Others, desperate for recruits, accepted batches they knew were compromised. The Lamenters suffered catastrophic luck, their gene seed seemingly cursed, every campaign they undertook ending in disaster despite their valor. The Flame Falcons developed spontaneous combustion, their bodies erupting in fire during battle, and the Inquisition declared them heretics and exterminated the chapter. The Sons of Antaeus grew to inhuman size and resilience, their gene seed obviously corrupted, but they were too useful to destroy, and the Imperium looked away. Knowledge was lost with every generation. The technology of the Great Crusade could not be replicated. The Mechanicum guarded their secrets jealously, and much of what they guarded they no longer understood, maintaining machines through ritual rather than comprehension. Space Marine chapters hoarded relics from the heresy era, ancient suits of Terminator armor and Volkite weapons that could not be replaced if destroyed. The gene seed tithes to Mars ensured that no chapter could hoard their genetic legacy, but the process also meant that gene seeds sat in Mechanicum vaults for centuries, stockpiled against future need, but also vulnerable to loss if those vaults were destroyed. The Age of Apostasy nearly tore the Imperium apart from within. Goj Vandire, a mortal tyrant, seized control of both the ecclesiarchy and the administratum, establishing a reign of terror that lasted for decades. He commanded the brides of the Emperor, an all-female military order, and used them to enforce his will. The Space Marines remained aloof from the conflict initially, viewing it as a mortal affair, but when Vandier's insanity threatened to plunge the Imperium into civil war, they acted. The Adeptus Custodes, emerging from their long seclusion, presented the brides with evidence of Vandier's crimes, and the brides executed the tyrant themselves. The crisis ended, but the Imperium was changed. The ecclesiarchy was forbidden from maintaining men under arms, and the brides became the Adepta Sororitas, an all-female militant order that served as the Inquisition's chamber militant. The chapters evolved in isolation, separated by vast distances and warp storms. Each chapter developed its own culture, traditions, and interpretations of the Codex Astartes. The Marines Malevolent became notorious for ruthlessness, willing to bombard civilian populations if enemy forces were present. The Mantis Warriors, shamed by their participation in the Badab War, embarked on a penitent crusade that lasted a century. The Celestial Lions questioned the Inquisition's methods and were nearly annihilated in retribution, their numbers reduced to a handful of survivors who swore vengeance. The Mentors became experts in training Imperial Guard regiments, fighting alongside mortal soldiers and teaching them tactics the Guard could actually employ. The gene curses defined entire bloodlines. The sons of Sanguinius bore the red thirst and black rage, madness and hunger intertwined. The sons of Rus risked becoming wolfen, beasts that could barely be controlled. The sons of Corax suffered mutations that marked them as different, even among space marines. The sons of the Lion carried the weight of secret shame, hunting fallen across the galaxy while the Imperium wondered why the Dark Angels never fully committed to any campaign. The Sons of Dawn felt no pain, their nerve endings deliberately numbed through gene modification and surgical augmentation, and they tested themselves through rituals of suffering, believing that endurance was the highest virtue. The Sons of Ferrus replaced flesh with metal until they were more machine than man, despising weakness in any form. The Tyranids arrived from beyond the galaxy. Hive fleet Behemoth struck first, consuming worlds at the eastern fringe, and the Imperium responded with the full might of the Ultramarines. The first tyrannic war ended at Macragge, where the Ultramarines and their successors fought a desperate defense that cost them nearly half their chapter. The Hive mind was driven back, but it had learned. Hive fleet Kraken came next, fragmenting into tendrils that struck across multiple sectors simultaneously, overwhelming defenses through sheer numbers. The Space Marines fought the Tyranids in boarding actions and planetary sieges, and they learned that this enemy could not be negotiated with, could not be corrupted, could not be turned. The Tyranids simply consumed, and they would not stop until the galaxy was stripped of biomass. Hive fleet Leviathan threatened Baal itself. The Blood Angels' homeworld came under assault from a Tyranid swarm so vast it blotted out the stars. Every Blood Angel's successor chapter answered the call, returning to defend the world where Sanguinius had been born. They fought in the irradiated wastes, holding back swarms that outnumbered them 1,000 to 1, and they bled the Hive fleet white through sheer determination and sacrifice. The Blood Angels were saved by the opening of the Great Rift, a warp storm so massive it tore the galaxy in half, disrupting the hive mind's synaptic control and causing the swarm to falter. The 13th Black Crusade shattered Cadia. Abaddon the Despoiler launched his greatest invasion, and this time he did not withdraw. The fortress world of Cadia, which had held the line against chaos for 10,000 years, was besieged by traitor forces beyond counting. The Space Marines deployed in force Black Templars, Imperial Fists, Ultramarines, and dozens of other chapters converged on Cadia to hold the line. They fought across the planet's surface, in its hive cities and fortress monasteries, and they bled for every meter of ground. But Abaddon was willing to sacrifice everything for victory. He hurled a Blackstone fortress, an ancient superweapon, at Cadia, and the planet shattered, its destruction tearing open a warp rift that would become the Great Rift. The galaxy was split. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, cut the Imperium in half, separating the Emperor's light from billions of worlds. The Dark Imperium, the half beyond the rift, was isolated, cut off from terra, surrounded by warp storms and chaos incursions. The Space Marines on that side of the rift fought alone, no reinforcements coming, no resupply possible. They became scavengers, maintaining their war gear through salvage and desperation, their gene seed reserves dwindling, their numbers shrinking with every battle. The Imperium stood on the brink of annihilation. 10,000 years of attrition had worn it down, eroded its strength, reduced its territories. The Space Marine chapters were scattered, isolated, fighting 1,000 wars on 1,000 worlds, and losing more battles than they won. The dream of the Great Crusade was a myth, the unity of the legions, a distant memory. The chapters endured because they knew no other way to exist. They were born to fight, and they would fight until the last gene seed failed and the last battle brother fell. But in the darkness, a light was returning. The galaxy tore itself apart on the day Cadia fell. The warp rift that had been contained for 10 millennia by the Fortress World's pylons erupted across the void, a wound in reality that stretched from the Eye of Terror to the eastern fringe. The cicatrix maledictum consumed entire sectors, swallowing them into madness and unreality. Warp storms raged across the Imperium, isolating worlds that had communicated freely for centuries. Demonic incursions manifested on planets that had never known chaos, their populations driven mad or slaughtered before the Imperium could respond. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allowed warp travel, flickered and dimmed, its light barely reaching beyond the solar segmentum. Ships were lost in the immaterium, their navigator houses unable to chart courses through the turbulence. The Imperium was dying, fracturing into a million isolated fragments, and there was no force powerful enough to hold it together, except one. On Macragge, in the depths of the fortress of Hera, Robute Guilliman had lain in stasis for 10,000 years. He had been struck down by the traitor Primarch Fulgrim during the scouring, poisoned by a blade that kept him suspended between life and death, his body preserved, but his consciousness trapped in eternal torment. The Ultramarines had maintained his shrine as a place of pilgrimage, their gene-father frozen in his moment of defeat, and for millennia they had prayed for his return while believing it impossible. The Archmagos Belisarius Cawl came to Macragge with a solution that bordered on heresy. Cawl was ancient even by Mechanicum standards, his body so heavily augmented that barely a fragment of original flesh remained. He had labored in secret since the heresy, following directives given to him by Guilliman himself in the aftermath of the siege. The Primarch had foreseen the Imperium's decline and tasked Cawl with creating contingencies, weapons and warriors that could be deployed when the hour was darkest. Cawl had obeyed, working for 10,000 years in hidden forge complexes, and now he returned with the fruit of his labors, a cure for Guilliman's poison and an army to match. The Inari accompanied him, Eldar who worshipped a nascent god of death and rebirth. The alliance was blasphemous by imperial standards, Xenos and human working together, but desperation made strange companions. The Inari needed Guilliman alive for reasons they would not fully explain, something about the balance of the galaxy and the survival of their race. Cawl needed the Inari's power to complete the resurrection. The Ultramarines, faced with the choice between accepting Xeno's aid or watching their Primarch die in truth, chose survival over dogma. Yvraine, emissary of Yenid, placed her hand on Guilliman's chest and channeled the god's power. The poison that had sustained him in living death was purged, his wounds closed. His eyes opened for the first time in 10 millennia, and Robute Guilliman rose from his deathbed to find the Imperium he had built reduced to ruins. The shock nearly broke him. He stood in the shrine surrounded by Ultramarines who knelt in worship, calling him Lord and Savior, and he understood immediately how far the Imperium had fallen. His father's imperial truth, the rejection of superstition and religion, had been abandoned. The Emperor was worshipped as a god. The Mechanicum performed rituals where once they had practiced science. The Imperium had become everything the Great Crusade had sought to destroy, and Guilliman was the only Primarch who could witness the betrayal of 10,000 years of decay. But there was no time for mourning. Macragge was under assault by the forces of chaos, and the Imperium was fragmenting. Guilliman donned the armor of fate, a relic suit that had been maintained in preparation for his return, and took up the Emperor's sword, a blade that burned with his father's power. He led the Ultramarines in a counterattack that drove the traitors from Macragge's surface, his tactical genius and physical might turning the tide of battles that had seemed lost. But Guilliman understood that one Primarch, even one as gifted as himself, could not save the Imperium alone. He needed armies, fleets, resources beyond anything the current Imperium could provide. Belisarius Cawl revealed what he had been building. In the vaults beneath Mars and on forge worlds scattered across the galaxy, Cawl had created the Primaris Space Marines. They were the result of 10 millennia of genetic research, improvements on the original Astartes design authorized by Guilliman himself before he fell. The primarchs were taller, stronger, their gene seed more stable, their organs more efficient. They bore 3 additional implants beyond the 19 that defined the original Space Marines: the sinew coils that enhanced strength, the magnificat that improved all other organs' function, and the Belisarian furnace that allowed them to survive injuries that would kill even a standard Astartes. They were equipped with new patterns of armor and weapons: Mark X power armor that combined the flexibility of lighter marks with the protection of Terminator plate, and bolt rifles that fired with greater range and penetration than the standard bolter. Hundreds of thousands of primarchs waited in stasis, ready to be awakened. Guilliman authorized their deployment immediately. The primarchs were organized into new chapters, founded from the gene seed of all 9 remaining loyalist legions. Some were traditional, following the Codex Astartes and adopting the heraldry and culture of established chapters. Others were entirely new, the unnumbered sons who bore no legacy except the Imperium's survival, warriors who would fight wherever they were needed without the weight of tradition or ancestral grudges. Cawl had also created the technology to transform existing Space Marines into primarchs, a dangerous procedure called the Rubicon Primaris that killed many who attempted it, but offered those who survived a new lease on immortality. The Indomitus Crusade was launched from Macragge. Guilliman gathered the largest fleet assembled since the Great Crusade, thousands of ships carrying Primaris reinforcements, Imperial Guard regiments, Mechanicum war engines, and the remnants of chapters that had been shattered by the opening of the Great Rift. The Crusade's objective was simple: drive a corridor through the warp storms to Terra, reinforce the Imperium's fragmenting defenses, and restore some semblance of order before the realm collapsed entirely. Guilliman took personal command, his strategic genius coordinating campaigns across 100 sectors simultaneously, deploying forces where they could achieve maximum impact. The Crusade carved through the darkness. Fleet Primus, commanded by Guilliman himself, struck toward Terra through the heart of the warp storms. The journey took subjective years, though only months passed in real space, and the fleet fought void battles against chaos armadas and demonic entities that manifested in the Materium. The Primaris fought their first battles in the corridors of burning ships, boarding actions where their superior resilience and firepower proved decisive. They cleared hulks infested with Nurgle's plague daemons, held bulkheads against World Eater's berserkers, and purged warp-tainted bridge crews who had turned their vessels into floating temples to the ruinous powers. Fleet Secundus pushed into the Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy beyond the Great Rift. This was the more desperate mission, reinforcing chapters and worlds that had been cut off from Terra's light, surrounded by enemies and slowly bleeding out. The Primaris arrived like angels of salvation, descending from the warp to battlefields where firstborn Astartes had been fighting for months or years without resupply. But the integration was not smooth. The firstborn looked upon the Primaris with suspicion. These new warriors who claimed superiority, who bore gene seed modifications that seemed dangerously close to heresy. Some chapters welcomed them without question. Others subjected them to trials and tests before accepting them as battle brothers. A few rejected them entirely, viewing the Primaris as Cawl's abominations rather than the Emperor's angels. The Blood Angels received their Primaris reinforcements on bail. The chapter had been reduced to a fraction of its strength, fighting Hive Fleet Leviathan, their fortress monastery breached, their gene seed vaults nearly exhausted. Commander Dante, the oldest living Space Marine, had led the defense for weeks, watching his brothers fall to the Black Rage and the endless swarms of tyrannid bioforms. When the Primaris arrived, Dante wept openly, overcome by gratitude and despair in equal measure. The Primaris bore the gene seed of Sanguinius, carried the same curse, but Cawl's modifications had delayed its manifestation. They were not immune to the Red Thirst or the Black Rage, but they endured longer before succumbing. Dante accepted them immediately, integrating them into his depleted companies, and together they drove the Tyrannids from Baal's surface. But the curse remained. The first Primaris Blood Angel to fall to the Black Rage did so during the defense of Baal Secundus. His mind shattered by visions of Sanguinius's death, his brothers forced to restrain him before he turned his weapons on allies. Dante understood then that Calth's work had not cured the flaw, merely postponed it. The sons of Sanguinius would endure their curse for eternity, primaris or firstborn, and no amount of genetic manipulation could erase what their primarch had suffered. The Dark Angels received primaris with characteristic paranoia. The Sons of the Lion scrutinized the new warriors for any sign of corruption or infiltration, subjecting them to interrogations that bordered on torture. The primaris bore it without complaint, understanding that trust had to be earned. But when the Dark Angels deployed them in battle, they did not share the full truth of the fallen, did not induct them into the inner circle's secrets. The primaris fought alongside their firstborn brothers, without understanding why certain battles were abandoned mid-campaign, why entire companies would suddenly redeploy based on intelligence that was never explained. The divide between those who knew and those who did not deepened, and the Dark Angels became even more secretive, creating new circles of knowledge to contain information the primaris could not be trusted with. The Space Wolves rejected the Rubicon primaris almost universally. They viewed Calth's modifications with deep suspicion, believing that tampering with the Canis Helix risked destroying what made them Space Wolves. A few attempted the transformation, and most died, their bodies unable to reconcile Calth's modifications with the wolf gene seed's instability. Those who survived were changed in ways that disturbed their brothers, their connection to the Wolfen weakening, their pack bonds fraying. The Space Wolves accepted primaris reinforcements created from their gene seed, but they kept them separate, never fully integrating them into the great companies, treating them as useful strangers rather than true pack members. The Black Templars embraced the primaris without hesitation. They saw them as weapons the Emperor had provided, tools to continue the eternal crusade. The Black Templars had always disregarded the Codex's limitations, and the primaris allowed them to expand further, founding new crusade fleets and reinforcing existing ones. High Marshal Helbrecht authorized the Rubicon for any firstborn who wished to attempt it, accepting the casualties as the Emperor's will. The Black Templars surged across the galaxy with renewed strength, their zealotry amplified by the certainty that the Emperor had answered their prayers by sending the primaris. The Ultramarines integrated the primaris most successfully. Guilliman's own gene sons followed their primarch's will without question, accepting the new warriors as brothers and adopting the new wargear and tactics Calth had developed. The Ultramarines became the template for primaris integration. Their success held up as proof that the new Space Marines were the future of the Adeptus Astartes. Entire companies were reorganized around primaris squads, with firstborn veterans serving as sergeants and officers until the new warriors gained sufficient experience. The Ultramarines prosecuted the Indomitus Crusade with renewed vigor, their disciplined assaults and overwhelming firepower reclaiming worlds that had been lost to chaos or Xenos. Guilliman reached Terra after years of subjective travel through the warp. He descended to the Imperial Palace, expecting to meet his father, to discuss strategy and coordinate the Imperium's defense. Instead, he was led to the Golden Throne and saw what the Emperor had become. A desiccated corpse, more dead than alive, sustained only through the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every day. Guilliman stood before the throne and tried to communicate, reaching out with his psychic senses, seeking some fragment of the father he had known. What he received in return was overwhelming, incomprehensible, a mind so vast and alien that it barely recognized him as anything more than a useful tool. The Emperor had transcended humanity, become something closer to a god, and in that transcendence had lost whatever capacity for love or compassion had once existed. Guilliman left the throne room shattered. He had returned expecting to share the burden of the Imperium's defense, to work alongside his father as he had during the Great Crusade. Instead, he found himself alone, the last functional primarch in a galaxy that worshipped a corpse god who could barely acknowledge his existence. The weight of the Imperium settled on Guilliman's shoulders, and he understood that there would be no relief, no support, no one to share the impossible task of holding together a realm that should have collapsed millennia ago. He became Lord Commander of the Imperium. It was a title he had not sought, but no one else could fill the role. Guilliman reorganized the Imperium's defenses, streamlining supply lines, purging incompetent officials, and deploying forces with strategic precision that had not been seen since the Great Crusade. He authored new doctrines, updated the Codex Astartes to account for primarchs tactics, and personally led campaigns against the Imperium's most dangerous enemies. But he also saw the rot at the Imperium's core, the ecclesiarchy's fanaticism, the administratum's bureaucratic paralysis, the Inquisition's paranoid purges. He tried to reform these institutions and found them resistant to change, entrenched in traditions and power structures that viewed any alteration as heresy. The indomitous crusade continued for a century. Fleet after fleet pushed into the darkness, reinforcing beleaguered chapters, founding new ones, and driving back the forces of chaos that had surged through the Great Rift. The primarchs proved themselves in battle after battle, their superior strength and resilience allowing them to hold ground where Firstborn would have been overwhelmed. But they also paid in blood, learning the hard lessons that the Firstborn had absorbed over millennia. The primarchs discovered that strength alone was not enough, that the galaxy's horrors could not be defeated through firepower and endurance. They watched brothers fall to the gene curses, saw chapters torn apart by internal conflicts, and learned that the Imperium's enemies were not merely physical threats but ideological and spiritual ones. New chapters were founded using only Primaris gene seed. The Rift Stalkers, the Covenant of Fire, the Void Tridents, and hundreds more, all created from pure Primaris stock with no connection to the Firstborn traditions. These chapters had no history to uphold, no ancient grudges to maintain, no secrets inherited from the heresy. They were the Imperium's future, unburdened by the past, and they fought with a clarity that older chapters had lost. But they also lacked the wisdom that came from millennia of experience, the understanding of threats that could not be defeated through conventional warfare. The Primaris-only chapters suffered catastrophic losses when they encountered enemies like the Alpha Legion or the Thousand Sons, foes who fought through deception and sorcery rather than straightforward combat. The gene curses persisted. Cal's modifications had not cured the flaws, only delayed or mitigated them. Primaris Blood Angels still fell to the red thirst. Primaris Space Wolves still risked becoming wolfen. Primaris Dark Angels were still born into a chapter consumed by secret shame. The curses were woven into the gene seed itself, inheritances from primarchs who had been shaped by forces beyond biology. No amount of genetic manipulation could erase what Sanguinius had suffered, what the Lion had hidden, what Russ had embraced. The Primaris were stronger, but they were not free. Guilliman confronted this truth during the Plague Wars. Mortarion, Daemon Primarch of the Death Guard, invaded Ultramar with a plague so virulent it killed worlds in days. The Primaris fought alongside the Firstborn, and both fell to Nurgle's diseases with equal frequency. Cal's modifications provided some resistance, but the plagues adapted, mutating to target the Primaris organs specifically. Guilliman dueled Mortarion personally, the two Primarchs clashing in the ruins of a hive city while their sons died around them. The battle ended inconclusively, Mortarion withdrawing when the Emperor's power channeled through Guilliman's sword proved too dangerous to endure. But the message was clear: the Primaris were not invincible, not saviors, merely the next generation of warriors in a war that would never end. The Imperium stabilized, but it did not recover. The Indomitus Crusade reclaimed thousands of worlds, but millions remained lost. The Great Rift continued to divide the galaxy, and the Dark Imperium beyond it fought alone, slowly losing ground. Guilliman established new fortress worlds, reorganized the defenses, and ensured that the Imperium would endure for at least another few centuries. But he knew it was a temporary measure, a bandage on a mortal wound. The Imperium was dying, had been dying for 10,000 years, and all he could do was delay the inevitable. The legacy of the legions endured in their successors. The gene seed of Sanguinius, the pride of Fulgrim, the wrath of Angron, the paranoia of the Lion, the savagery of Russ, all of it lived on in the chapters that bore their genetic heritage. The Primaris inherited these traits just as the Firstborn had, and they would carry them forward into whatever future remained. The Space Marines were humanity's defenders still, but they were also its prisoners, bound by curses and flaws that could never be fully expunged, fighting wars that served an Imperium that had become a cruel parody of the dream they had been created to build. Guilliman stood on the walls of the Imperial Palace and looked out across Terra. The sky was choked with pollution and orbital traffic. The hive cities stretched to the horizon, monuments to humanity's endurance and desperation. Somewhere beneath the palace, his father sat on the golden throne, neither living nor dead, holding back demons through eternal torment. Guilliman had returned to save the Imperium, and he had succeeded in preventing its immediate collapse. But he could not restore what had been lost. The Great Crusade was over. The dream of unity was dead. The Emperor's vision had curdled into theocratic tyranny. The Space Marines remained what they had always been, immortal warriors carrying the genetic legacy of demigods who had fallen 10,000 years ago. Some had turned to chaos, embracing the very powers the Emperor had sought to destroy. Others remained loyal, fighting in the Emperor's name, even as the Imperium betrayed everything he had stood for. The primarchs were simply the newest generation, taller and stronger, but bearing the same curses, fighting the same enemies, serving the same cruel necessity. They were born to war, and they would die in war. And when the last of them fell, the Imperium would follow. But until that day, they would endure. The Emperor's angels, broken and faithful, standing guard over a species that had forgotten how to dream of anything beyond survival. The genetic heirs of 20 legions that had once conquered the galaxy, now scattered across 1,000,000 worlds, holding back the dark with bolter and blade. They were the Adeptus Astartes, and they knew no fear. They knew only duty, and duty would sustain them until the stars themselves went cold.